As you'll gather, Denise and I are out of town, and I'll leave it to you to decide where. Maybe I'll give you some clues in the coming days. But at any rate, it's August the 12th, and I pray you're all doing well. I know for us it was nice to get out of town. Well, if you've been listening to my previous few little talks, you'll know that I was talking about Psalms. I talked about Psalm 1 and then Psalm 2, and so today I thought I'd talk about Psalm 3. Now, again, I'm not saying I'm going to go through all of the Psalms. I'm just, as I read it today, I thought, well, that's got a good message for us. And so today, Psalm 3 is for all of those who are discouraged, seemingly surrounded by problems, some overwhelmed, and I'm sure there are some who are on the verge of feeling defeated. I know some are going through really tough times with COVID. I know that one young lady that I've heard about has had this terrible disease for now 49 days. But I'm praying that maybe some of this will be relevant to you, and I hope and pray that the Lord uses it. When we're in Psalms, we talk about David, and I think that sometimes, I know for me, I think of David as being the founder of Jerusalem, the most celebrated king in Israel's history, and it's easy to think, if you're not careful, that he had an easy and a smooth life. But in Psalm 3, David's in trouble. David's son Absalom had decided to take a family issue into his own hands, and he killed his half-brother Amnon for raping his sister. But as a punishment for his actions, Absalom was forced to live in exile for many years. He successfully pleaded with his father David that he'd be allowed to return to his homeland. And finally, King David, perhaps against his better judgment, but he allowed his king to return. But even when he returned, he refused to see him. And after 2 years of this carrying, Absalom forced David in to see him, and David decided to allow Absalom to have liberty and move freely around his kingdom. And despite the goodness of David to Absalom, Absalom was deceitful. He began to use all of his energies to convince everybody in the kingdom that he'd be better off with him as king rather than his father David. I'm tempted to ask, has anything like that ever happened to you? Somebody that you thought was your friend, thought was a relative, thought was out for your best, they turn against you. Well, that's what happened to David. And the Bible says that Absalom turned the heart of the people away from David. And at the time that this psalm was written, Absalom used guile and deception and lies and everything else to convince nearly 10,000 of his soldiers, of David's soldiers, to join him, Absalom. And so Jerusalem became a hotbed of rebellion, and King David now had to flee. And eventually David took over the city, took over the throne of Jerusalem. He even claimed 10 of David's wives as his own, and he had control over David's chief advisors. But the fact is, whether David or you or I, nobody goes through life without facing troubles. I don't think I've faced any troubles like that. But nevertheless, we all have troubles. And, David was said to be a man after God's own heart. And I think many times the enemy chases those who are pleasing to the Lord and doing something worthwhile for the Lord. But in Psalm 3 verse 1, it titles it a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. And he says in verse 1, he says, Lord, how they are increased that trouble me. Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. So David cries out to God, and he cries out irrespective of what others may be saying, because he knows that God does care for his own, and God will hear the cry of his children. So David cries out, and I think nevertheless, it's not fun to be abandoned, right? It's not fun to be deserted. But he says then in verse 3, but thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter of mine head. So he reminds himself that the Lord is his shield. And now David's out there hiding without his palace, his throne, many of the creature comforts. David used to be king, still is king, but he's on the run, and David takes an inventory of what he has left. And what he says is the Lord is our shield. He's our protection. So there's no doubt that David was going through tough times. And I think that God's people have always been the targets of the enemy. But God himself is always our shield in the time of battle. And it's more than that. He's our sustainer. And he says in verse 4, I cried out with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. So guess what? In the middle of despair, in the middle of trouble, in the middle of his son turning against him, 10,000 of his troops having changed sides, he cried to the Lord, and he says, he heard me out of his holy hill. God always hears. And then I like what it says in verse 5. It says, I laid me down and slept. Tell you what, that's somebody who's experiencing peace. If you can experience peace and you can lay down and sleep in the middle of everything else that's going on, that's an amazing thing. I laid me down and I slept. I awakened, for the Lord sustained me. The Lord is our sustainer. And God was there for him. He heard him, and not only did he hear him, but he gave him peace. He enabled him to sleep, and he awoke invigorated. And so David understood that he wasn't alone. But then in verse 6 it says, I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. Why? Because it doesn't matter who opposes. It doesn't matter whether there's 1 or 10,000. The fact is that with God, you are a majority. And then in verse 7 it says, Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. So guess what? Our victory is not going to be determined by our ability or even our ability to fight. It's not counting on our numerical advantage, because God is with us. And David cites what happened. So, he'd faced great giants before, right? He'd faced a bear and a lion, and he'd faced Goliath. But David is confident. And he says in verse 8, as we close here, he said, Salvation belongeth to the Lord. Thy blessing is on thy people. Selah. So, guess what? You can be going through the biggest problems. You can be going through seemingly impossible circumstances. But with God, you are secure, because salvation is ours. I don't want to give you a big Bible teaching today, but it is interesting to note that Absalom was so sure of victory that he celebrated a little early. He took over the palace and he parted with David's wives that night. But what he failed to realize is that in a moment things can turn. God can change night into darkness. He can change despair into victory. And there he was, the most handsome man in the whole of Israel. It said his hair weighed 7 pounds. Well, I doubt mine weighs 3 ounces, but his hair weighed 7 pounds. And so after a night of celebration, Absalom and his men caught up with David. There was a great battle, and the rebel army was utterly destroyed. More than 20,000 were killed outright, and even more got tangled up in the woods that night. And Absalom himself, while riding on his mule, went through a thicket or something, and it says that he was taken up between heaven and earth. So he was lifted up off the ground, got his hair caught in the tree, and it says the mule that was under him went on. So we learn that victory is ours, and in the most unlikely ways, maybe, we're going to experience victory. Who would have ever thought of this rebellious young man who gloried in his 7 pounds of hair? It was his 7 pounds of hair that was his undoing. So for those of us who've lost a lot of our hair, there's a silver lining in that there cloud. So I pray that will be a little word of encouragement to you. Not the numbers, not our ability to fight. None of that matters, because the Lord is on our side. I'll see you again tomorrow. God bless you. Bye-bye.